Okay, hello everybody. Sorry about the slight delay while we sorted out some technical issues, but I think we've got it all sorted now. So hello to everybody here in person and to those joining us on Zoom. So I'm Brett Scholes. Normally Joe or Nicole would open, but I've opted to open to introduce our very special guest speaker today. Before I do introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on unceded and colonized Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on the impact of colonization and its ongoing effects in terms of well-being and the kinds of access to well-being and the kinds of life that people want to live, which is a real touch point for the Singaporean context for gay men and the impacts and ongoing impacts of colonization in that context. So I'm holding that kind of, I guess, impression and thought with me as I was reading through Alif's abstract, and is something that I'll continue to think about throughout this session. So, as you will have seen, we have a very special guest speaker joining us today from James Cook University Singapore campus. It's a real pleasure to introduce you to Muhamad Alif Bin Ibrahim, who I have the pleasure of knowing through the International Society of Critical Health Psychology, where he is a member of our executive. And today he will be presenting some of his work about relationship resilience among gay men in long-term relationships in Singapore. I've been very excited about it, so I'm going to shut up and hand over to him to get to all of the interesting content. But yes, if you could welcome Alif, and thank you.
Right. Thank you, Brett, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today to listen to this research session where I will talk about a research study that I conducted on the lived experiences of gay men in long-term relationships and the ways in which they cope and maintain their relationships despite the social and political stresses that they face in Singapore.
Just need to click on the slides just to activate. Yeah.
Okay. So just a little bit about me. So my research career started out in 2013 at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, which is a public healthcare institution in Singapore. And I was tasked then to look at the reasons why doctors don't wash their hands at the hospital. So we conducted focus groups and tried to find out what were some of the barriers or challenges that doctors face in not washing their hands when they tend to patients at the hospital. And I was also fortunate to have undertaken my bachelor's degree in psychology at Murdoch University during that time. And then subsequently, I undertook my honours year at the James Cook University campus in 2019, and then subsequently upgraded to a PhD in 2020. And as Brett mentioned, I'm also a student representative at the International Society of Critical Health Psychology. I'm very grateful for the wonderful opportunities that have been given to me as part of that society. And the past 2 weeks, I was actually in Sydney. I am also a visiting research fellow at the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre. So we had a summer program on gender and sexuality for 2 weeks. And this year's theme was actually on queer relationality. So so we talked about LGBTQ relationships, relationships between students and teachers, relationships between healthcare workers and their patients. So a lot of queer relationality work beyond just LGBTQ relationships, which I found really very interesting because my area of focus was just on romantic relationships within the LGBTQ community. And so some of the things that I have researched on, like I mentioned, I did some research work on why doctors, nurses, and pharmacists don't wash their hands before and after touching patients. Antibiotic prescribing among doctors. So why doctors still prescribe antibiotics when patients actually just have, a viral flu, for example, and not a bacterial infection. So So some of the things that they faced when facing patients at the emergency department, and why they still prescribe those antibiotics despite patients not having bacterial infections. I also did quite a bit of work with people living with HIV. So we wanted to understand why people living with HIV were not coming back to our clinic. So some of the things like financial issues, work, they were not able to, they didn't really like the clinicians that they were seeing. So they generally avoided coming down to the clinic and wanted to try and find ways to circumvent seeing that particular clinician, for example. We also did some work on access to PrEP services among gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men, as well as transgender sex workers here in Singapore. And in more recent years, I started doing more gender and sexuality work, which was where I researched on LGBTQ couples and families in the Singapore context. So moving back to my main presentation today, we all know that social and political attitudes towards lesbian, gay, transgender, and queer individuals have evolved in recent decades. So in their analysis of the World Values Survey, Ayub and Gerritsen highlighted how there is a global shift towards the acceptance of homosexuality between the 1980s and the 2010s. So the authors found that tolerance towards and acceptance of LGBTQ individuals, LGBTQ communities around the world have increased in almost every continent worldwide. And the photo and the graph that you see on your right details how increases in such acceptance and tolerance of LGBTQ rights and communities can also be seen in Asia. So this includes countries like Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, and India, which have all seen double-digit increases in acceptance of homosexuality, as well as increases in LGBTQ rights over the last decade or so. Despite this shift in societal and political attitudes towards homosexuality, many countries still do not recognize LGBTQ individuals, their relationships, and families. So according to the latest tabulations by the Human Dignity Trust in 2023, 65 countries still criminalize adult consensual same-sex activity. 12 countries still have the death penalty on their books, or at least the possibility of the death penalty, even for private consensual same-sex activity. And these countries include like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Brunei, Qatar, UAE, and Uganda. And 14 countries still criminalize the gender identity and or expression of transgender people in their respective nations. So marriage provides various legal and financial protections to couples and families in many places around the world. While not everyone wants to get married for various reasons, the ability to choose to get married remains limited for LGBTQ couples. So in terms of same-sex marriage and legal recognition, this is a pictorial of where same-sex marriage and or where same-sex couples can get legally recognized around the globe. So nearly 36 countries have marriage equality, and more than half of these countries can be found in Western Europe, the Americas, here in Australia, and also in New Zealand. And as of June 2023, only 34 countries have legally recognized same-sex marriage, with the most recent country, I think, is Estonia, having passed a law on June 20th of last year, legalizing same-sex marriage, which I think came into effect 1st January of this year. So we can see how the lack of legal recognition for same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage, still exists in many parts of Asia, Africa, and also the Middle East. So what about the situation in Singapore? So similar to surveys and studies done around the world, we did a national survey in 2019, which was conducted by the Institute of Policy Studies at the National University of Singapore. And we did find that Singaporeans were becoming more liberal towards homosexuality, gay sex, and same-sex marriage as compared to 5 years ago. Another major landmark win for the LGBTQ rights in Singapore and the LGBTQ community in Singapore was actually the repeal of Section 377A in 2022. So Section 377A, which criminalized sex between men, was first introduced in 1938 during the British colonial rule, and was subsequently inherited by the Singapore government when we gained independence in 1965. And so when Section 377A was still around, gay and bisexual men remained under persecution due to this particular penal code, which states that any male person in public or private who commits an act of gross indecency with another male person shall be punished for a term which may extend up to 2 years. And the Singapore government finally decided to repeal Section 377A in November 2022, which was just a couple of years ago. And this was actually lauded by many of the LGBTQ individuals, organizations, and allies of the LGBTQ community. Yet, even as that repeal came into existence, even as attitudes and acceptance towards the LGBTQ community improved in recent decades, much still remains to be done for the LGBTQ community in Singapore. While the government did repeal Section 377A in 2022, they also included various provisions with that repeal. So one of the provisions is that they would protect the heterosexual marriage, the heteronormative family structure in Singapore, the traditional nuclear family in Singapore. So LGBTQ couples and families are still marginalized. They are still put out of reach from the many benefits and privileges that include priority and subsidies in public housing, and other parts of social life in Singapore that are given or taken for granted by heterosexual individuals, couples, and their families. Moreover, the LGBTQ community continues to be marginalized in other ways, including the continued lack of positive LGBTQ representations in education and mainstream media, and the heteronormative family ideals. The traditional nuclear family continues to be prized above everything else and everyone else in Singapore's socio-political discourse. And the stresses and challenges that LGBTQ couples and families face is not just limited to the material effects of the social stigma, of the discrimination that impacts their relationships and families, but they are also discursively constructed as subordinate to heterosexual couples and traditional families in Singapore. So this was actually a discourse analysis that I did of 170 articles dating back from 2014 to the end of 2022. So what I wanted to find out was how are LGBTQ couples and families constructed or discussed in the mainstream news media. And what I found, these are the 4 main constructions from that particular analysis. And we can see how most of the constructions or representations of LGBTQ couples and families remain very negative. And even the positive ones, like how LGBTQ couples and families are just as committed and loving in their relationships and family units, even then, such constructions are deeply intertwined and compared with the heterosexual family unit. So they're never exactly free from that particular comparison, even when it's a positive construction. Despite these material and discursive stresses, challenges, and barriers to their relationships, LGBTQ couples and families still exist in the Singapore context. They still form relationships, maintain them over time, and some of them even have children through various ways and means, even though such means are typically hard and expensive for many couples in Singapore. But they still find ways to make their relationships and families work, despite the lack of social support, despite the lack of legal recognition within the Singapore context. And so when I first conceptualized this study, I wanted to do something on LGBTQ couples, and I was reviewing the literature at that time. And much of the work that has been done on LGBTQ couples and families, whether it's within Singapore, whether it's within the broader scholarly literature, a lot of it has focused much on the stigma, the discrimination, the negative processes and outcomes of being in such in LGBTQ relationships. But much has not yet been researched on what keeps these couples going, what helps these couples maintain their relationships despite the hardships that they face. And personally, for me, even for myself, I'm in a long-term relationship of 11 years. And I know other couples as well who have been together for 10, 20, 30 years through my work and my friends in the LGBTQ community in Singapore. And so I was curious to understand the strategies that these couples use to keep their relationships going, maintaining their relationships, especially in a society such as Singapore, where such relationships, such families remain socially and legally unrecognized. So I decided to conduct an exploratory qualitative study utilizing Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, or IPA, to understand depth to understand in depth the lived experiences of these gay men in long-term relationships, in particular looking at the social and political stresses that they face, as well as the ways in which they cope and overcome these challenges as part of their long-term relationships. So what is IPA? So just briefly going through what this methodology is about, it's a qualitative research methodology that is aimed at understanding and exploring meanings of lived experiences. So basically what it means for people to have a certain experience, how people ascribe meaning to their experiences in their interactions with the environment. So as a methodology, IPA is a theoretically informed framework. So it consists of some theories, some data collection techniques, analytical strategies, and philosophical assumptions that guide the research process from beginning all the way until the end. So this differs slightly from your methods, such as your thematic analysis, your content analysis, where they just provide you with steps or recipes for analysis, but you have to bring in the different theories, the different theoretical lens that you want to build in as part of that method. So here I have a visualization of where IPA is situated within the broader ontological and epistemological spectrum. So this is something that I have been slowly building up as I go through the different papers that I read throughout my PhD. And so some of the methodologists or some of the people who develop the methods may not agree where I place them, but this is my own placement of the different where the different methods are actually situated within. So yeah, so I hope this gives a better visualization of where IPA is situated within the broader landscape of qualitative methods. So I mentioned earlier how IPA has theoretical frameworks built into it as a methodology. So there are three theoretical underpinnings of IPA. So the first one is phenomenology, which is the study of lived experiences. So phenomenology concerns itself with the lived experience, whether this is the first person experience or the lived experience of others, which then focuses on how people perceive or talk about objects and events. And therefore, we take a step back and examine the relations, the experiences that we take for granted in our day-to-day life. The next theoretical underpinning for IPA is hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is a theory of interpretation, which originated with the interpretation of biblical texts. So hermeneutics is about interpretation as experience cannot be directly plucked out from people's heads. So what we do is that we try and engage and interpret participants' experiences as we do the research. So we talk about the hermeneutic circle, where there's this iterative process of moving between the units, the small units of meaning and the larger units of meaning, moving between the parts and the whole of a person's lived experience or story. And the final theoretical underpinning is ideography. So with this particular methodology, it privileges the particulars, the individual person. So as much as we interview many people, we also privilege each of their views, each of their experiences, before we then connect their experiences to other people's experiences during the analysis. So the fundamental principle with ideography is to explore every single case, giving each case equal attention before we produce any general statements or themes from the analysis itself. And so these are my research questions. Research questions in IPA typically revolve what and how questions. So we look at processes, meaning-making mechanisms, and we therefore decide to ground out I decided to ground my study in the following three research questions. And let's see. And so in terms of sample size and sampling strategy, typically IPA researches small homogeneous groups of participants, and the participants were purposely sampled and recruited from Singapore's LGBTQ community with the assistance of the three LGBTQ organizations that you see down below. So what happened is that I sent the recruitment poster to these organizations, and what they did was to publish the posters on their websites. Potential participants were then provided with the information sheet when they contacted me to see if they were still interested in taking part in the study. And if they agreed, I made an appointment for the interview after we agreed on a suitable time and date for the interview to be conducted. So participants were recruited based on the following inclusion criteria. We included participants who identified as cisgender gay men. We only recruited cisgender individuals for this study because we wanted to maintain the homogeneity of participants and their lived experiences. We also acknowledged that transgender gay men in long-term relationships may have different experiences of the social and political stresses in Singapore, and consequently how that actually impacts the ways that they cope and overcome the stresses in the Singapore context. Participants will also need to be above 21 years of age, Singapore citizens or permanent residents, and they need to be in a long-term romantic relationship of at least 5 years. This particular inclusion criteria was based on studies that found that relationships of less than 3 years were more likely to be unstable, and therefore there's an increased likelihood of dissolution. And we wanted couples to have remained together for 5 years or more because there were various couple-specific investments that made the dissolution of their relationships more costly. So ethical approval for this study was obtained from James Cook University's Human Research Ethics Committee. One-to-one interviews were conducted in small, quiet interview rooms that were approved by the Ethics Review Committee. These rooms actually allowed for the interviews to be conducted in safe and private setting while maintaining participants' confidentiality, as well as minimizing any undue intrusion. So I also developed a semi-structured interview guide that was purposely developed from the literature to explore participants' long-term relationship experiences in a Singapore context. So some of the questions that I asked included, can you tell me about the people who know about your relationship, and how did these people react when you told them about your long-term relationship? And what are some of the legal challenges that you experience from being in this particular long-term relationship? So things like, have you thought about marriage? What about inheritance? Medical decision-making, for example. Have you discussed that with your partner, or how did that go about? And informed consent and participants' demographics were obtained before the commencement of each interview. We did not collect any personal identifiers due to the sensitive nature of the study. We assigned pseudonyms that participants chose. Participants chose the pseudonyms that they wanted as part of the study, and that was actually used throughout the study duration. So interviews lasted approximately 90 minutes. They were audio recorded, they were transcribed verbatim, and participants were also invited to participate in a feedback process where they reviewed their transcripts and clarified any further questions that arose from the analysis. So once the transcripts are completed, I proceeded to analyze the transcripts using the 6 analytical stages that are outlined in IPA. Just a note that this is the first analytical steps are actually from the first edition of IPA, which I used. Jonathan Smith and Michael Larkin actually revised the wordings of the IPA steps, the analysis steps in recent years, I think about last year or the year before. So the principles of analysis still remain the same, but the wording for each step or phase was reworded for further clarity. So it may differ from what you see in the second edition of the book. So in quantitative research, we would usually look at reliability and validity to assess if is this a good study or not? Can the study be improved? But in qualitative research, we typically use rigor, credibility, and trustworthiness criteria that we usually set out at the onset of the project design, which we then carry out throughout the process of inquiry all the way until writing up of the results. So for this study, I utilized the credibility and trustworthiness guidelines set up by Mace and Pope in 2000. So to foreground the participants' experiences, I practiced bracketing. So basically, this is setting aside or suspending my preconception and biases as I was reading through the transcripts and maintaining an attitude of curiosity to allow the experiences of the participants to speak through the audio recording transcripts as I was going through the analysis. I also undertook continuous journaling as part of the reflexivity process from data collection all the way until analysis to ensure that I'm aware of any personal or intellectual biases that arose throughout the study. I also undertook researcher triangulation with my supervisor, Dr. Joanna Ballas, at various stages of the analysis to ensure that I didn't miss certain parts or aspects of the participants' lived experiences. And as mentioned earlier, we also invited participants to review the transcripts to give us comments and feedback on the analysis. So this is the member checking process, where we ensured that participants' lived experience remains central to the research process by getting them involved with the transcripts and analysis. And as part of my analysis, I also highlighted negative or deviant cases. So this contrasted the main narratives that are highlighted by through the themes that I generated. So this helped me ensure that I have given due consideration to all the voices and lived experience of the participants, not just those that were the loudest or the majority. And finally, I also documented and kept detailed records of all relevant aspects of my research. So this is the audit trail to ensure the transparency of my data collection and analysis process. So here are my findings. I interviewed a total of 9 participants as part of this study. So their age ranged from 31 to 54 years old. They were predominantly Chinese in ethnicity, and we had 2 Malay participants. I'm also Malay. And most of them are highly educated, and this was actually corroborated by subsequent surveys that I conducted, that a lot of the individuals in LGBTQ community in Singapore are actually highly educated as well, at least having a university degree or above. And for this study, the relationship duration or relationship length ranged from 7 to 27 years in duration. So 3 superordinate themes were generated at the end of the analysis process. So this highlights the processes, the strategies, the resources that participants had or undertook to cope and maintain their relationships against the social and political stresses here in Singapore. And here is the table to just give you a sense of the prevalence of the superordinate and subordinate themes among the 9 study participants, and how it maps back to the research questions that I had set out in the beginning of my presentation. So before I discuss the themes in more detail, we need to look at some of the ways or some of the things that participants describe as the stresses or challenges that they face that negatively impacted their relationships here in Singapore. So these included anticipating stigma and discrimination from society, the lack of recognition and acceptance from their social networks, which in turn leads to a lack of social support. So this study was done before the repeal of Section 377A, so they actually mentioned how they felt frustrated and even devalued at the continued existence of Section 377A. They also feared the consequences of not being able to get legally recognized or be given structural support from the government, which would have dire consequences on their relationship if they were to break up, or if someone in their if their partner passes away, for example, what happens then? There's no safety net for their relationships in that case. So this is a quote from Izwan. So some participants describe how they concealed their relationships from others as they feared facing potentially adverse reactions in the Singapore context. So here is one we can see that he reminisces about his time in New Zealand, that he and his partner felt free to be themselves in a country that made them feel safe about their sexuality and relationship. He related how he and his partner concealed their sexuality and acts of affection, akin to moving back into the gay closet, as they were worried about the potential negative reactions, the potential stigma and discrimination from his immediate surroundings in Singapore, as compared to when they were holidaying overseas in New Zealand. Other participants, like Sheldon here, were worried about not having the rights to make decisions for their partners in emergencies or life or death situations. So Sheldon feared the inability to make medical decisions for his partner, which may perhaps make him worry about losing precious time or be at the end of conflicting decisions being made for his partner, just because their relationship is not legally recognized under the eyes of the law. Other participants highlighted the stresses from planning their futures deliberately as compared to heterosexual marriages, heterosexual couples and families, which usually have various norms, policies that are established to protect such institutions. Gay couples in Singapore could not depend on their children, as is typical in Asian societies, or even the government policies to take care of them in old age. So this deliberate planning involves formalizing wills, lasting power of attorneys to protect their relationships legally. And here we can see how Brian related how the lack of legal recognition forced the couple to think of ways to secure their future that heterosexual couples usually don't need to think about consciously in the Singapore context. So moving on to the first superordinate theme here, I found participants cope with the socio-political stresses in Singapore by accepting and adapting to situations beyond their control. So despite fearing the potential ramifications of being in marginalized relationships, they accepted that, hey, these socio-political stresses are part and parcel of our lives, and we need to somewhat let go of the need for explicit recognition. So this external justification strategy enabled participants to reduce feelings of dissonance while externally conforming to socio-political norms. Moreover, most participants preferred living amicably, peacefully alongside the broader Singapore community, while finding peaceful ways to obtain their rights, obtaining equality, and such strategies actually helped participants to move forward with their relationships rather than constantly being worried about things that they could not have. So in the first sub-theme on accepting implicit recognition and minimizing explicit recognition, most participants described how they did not see the need to seek explicit recognition from people inside and outside of their social networks. So in the excerpt below, we can see how Rayson explained how he has never found the need to highlight his relationship explicitly to his family, just as the expression of love and other positive emotions remain highly constrained in Asian cultures. So he says, I have never said this is my boyfriend, just as I do not say I love you to my mom because she has never said that to me. It is the same kind of concept. And many participants also described how they had close relationships and ties with their respective families, and therefore they don't want to be seen as choosing between their families or their partners, as they felt that both relationships were important aspects of their lives. And so asking for explicit acknowledgement from their families about their sexuality or about their relationship could lead to this disruption of the social harmony that they currently have with their families of origin. So here we can see Brian explaining how he chose not to seek explicit recognition as he treasured the bonds that he had with his family, and perhaps feeling that the obligations and responsibilities he had towards his aging mother. So he chose instead to see specific actions by his mother as a form of implicit signals of acceptance of his partner. And similar to other participants, Brian also described how he saw invitations to family events, how his partner was invited to Chinese New Year, for example, as ways of how family members, his own family members, showed acceptance towards their relationship. So he says here, we are a very close-knit family. I don't believe in pushing for explicit recognition, especially with my mother. She is already 82 years old. If they can't accept him, I'm not going to reach a point where I would dump my family. I cannot do that. I already know my family accepts him. My mom started inviting him for her birthdays and Chinese New Year, so she's accepting in her own way. If that's her way of dealing with it, so be it. Beyond their social networks, other participants highlighted how they rationalize or minimize their need for social and legal structures that were only available to heterosexual couples and marriages. So here we can see both Rayson and Brian. They felt sad that their relationship still lacked legal recognition in Singapore. However, they also rationalized how marriage was just a piece of paper and believed that their relationships were strong enough without needing the marriage certificate to tell them that your relationships are valid or strong in some way or another. So we can see how Rayson said, marriage is just a piece of paper. You can go to the United States and get it signed, but that does not mean a lot to us. We've been together for 10 years. Having been together for so long helps us realize that getting married is truly a piece of paper. And interestingly, among participants who were able to live their lives openly, who were out and openly gay, They were also keenly aware or influenced by the socio-cultural norms and values within the Singapore context. So we have Aaron here, who was fortunate to receive explicit recognition from his parents. If I remember correctly, he was able to come out to his parents at a young age. He was also able to introduce his partner formally to his parents and family members. And therefore, that enabled him and his partner to celebrate events, festivities together peacefully. And here Aaron recounted how his mother would prepare special dishes for his partner during Chinese New Year, and he felt lucky to have such moments in his relationship. However, deep down, Aaron remained fearful that his parents might not still accept homosexuality and same-sex marriage due to generational differences and even Asian cultural values. So this was particularly salient when Aaron was planning for his wedding here in Australia, and he was actually having doubts or voices at the back of his head whether to invite his parents or family members, because he was worried they might not be comfortable coming to a gay wedding here in Australia. And building on that awareness of being in a socio-cultural context that may not be accepting of LGBTQ individuals and same-sex relationships, a number of participants also believe that the LGBTQ community must adapt and respond accordingly to its surrounding socio-political context. So this particular participant, Dominic, opined that the LGBTQ community was only able to influence society to a certain extent. So he felt that the community should let the socio-political situation evolve on its own and in its own time, rather than wasting efforts altering situations that they could not change, as such efforts was what he termed as very militant, and that can impact how the broader society actually views the LGBTQ community by pushing too much or being militant about fighting for rights and equality in Singapore. And that is not to say, however, that Dominic did not want to fight for equality at all. He saw nothing wrong in ensuring that society remain aware of the LGBTQ community's existence in the Singapore context. However, he and some of the other participants preferred to fight for equality and rights peacefully by contributing meaningfully to society, and this included helping to address issues of poverty, helping the disadvantaged, or even caring for other members of society. So in Dominic's view, he felt that being gay still carried much stigma, and as the Singapore society still perceived gays as effeminate, as drug users, as promiscuous, in giving back to society, he said he hoped to alter society's perceptions that gay people were just normal human beings in many areas of life. And in contrast, some participants believe in fighting aggressively against the socio-political inequality in Singapore. So one proponent who believed in taking an aggressive approach was actually Brian. So Brian was well aware that he was actually well aware of the peaceful proponents of fighting for equality and rights. But he said that he felt frustrated that the proponents of the peaceful approaches would chide him, would be angry at him for openly fighting for equality and rights, for example, against Section 377A of the Penal Code. So Brian felt that he was accused by some people in the community as wanting to have the limelight, as dragging the good name of the LGBTQ community into the spotlight by throwing the LGBTQ community under the bus. And he felt that while people can agree to disagree to approaching the fight to equality and rights in Singapore, they should not put each other down when we are already trying to deal with things being said about the LGBTQ community from the broader society. So in the second superordinate theme, all participants described how various social and financial resources help them cope or be shielded from stigma and discrimination. As I have explained earlier, many of the participants remain unwilling to disrupt the social harmony by seeking explicit recognition from their families of origin. So they highlighted how they sought emotional and instrumental support from their families of choice. And some participants also pointed to the ways in which their socio-economic status, their financial resources, enabled them to overcome some of the challenges and limitations of what they face in Singapore. So here we can see how participants explain that acceptance from their closest friends allowed them access to emotional and instrumental support. Here we can see Kamal, who related that he felt more at ease in showing affection, in showing his love for his partner in his friend's presence, while Rayson would consult his friends about problems and issues that come up as part of their long-term relationships. So families of choice was first coined by Weston in the 1990s, which represent a close, supportive network that provides a safe environment for same-sex couples or LGBTQ couples to be who they are without fear or judgment, as well as an additional avenue for providing the much-needed support and buffer when long-term relationships in the LGBTQ community faces issues. And interestingly, some participants highlighted how their financial security and social status actually shielded them from the socio-political stresses in Singapore. So these participants believe that being of high socioeconomic status allowed them to move around in social circles that were less judgmental, that were more liberal and accepting of their relationships. So in these two excerpts, we can see the ways in which Max and Dominic related how being of higher socioeconomic status, or SES, enabled their relationships to flourish, as their relationships were both surrounded by social circles, or what Dominic refers to as bubbles, that had perhaps more liberal values and therefore were accepting of same-sex relationships in Singapore. So Dominic says, we prefer to be in our circle, our own bubble, not have to deal with people's prejudice or biases, because at the end of the day, it's my life. You may not approve of it, but it's my life. And you don't have a say in how I live my life. I mean, it's not ideal, but I suppose we have to come to accept that it is what it is. You just create your own bubble and your own lifestyle, and you stay away from people that will give you trouble. Others use their financial resources to circumvent or overcome the structural barriers present in Singapore. So we can see here participants such as Dominic were able to purchase their own houses and formalize wills early on in their relationships. So a little bit of background about the housing situation in Singapore. I mentioned this to Brett yesterday. So if you're not legally recognized as a couple or family in Singapore, you are not able to buy a house of your own until you are 35 years old. So I just got my house like a couple of years ago. My partner got his own house like a couple of years when he just turned 36 last year. So if you're not legally recognized by the government, you don't qualify for housing early on in your relationship. You have to wait until you're 35, and then you are able to buy housing. And even then, you're only able to buy a 2-room flat from the government, or you can buy a more expensive house from the market if you wish for a bigger flat. But until you're 35 years old, most of us actually still live with our parents, with our families, and rent is very expensive. Housing is also expensive. And so without that legal recognition, we don't qualify for a lot of subsidies for housing. And we still remain, a lot of us still remain with our families until we are much older in age. So here, Dominic says, it's the reality of society structure. It's not something that we can change. We would have liked more protection or more recognition for our relationship. Fortunately, we are not directly affected by the structural barriers. I live in a private apartment. We have done up wills and legal power of attorneys to protect each other's rights and entitlements under the law. So they are able to buy private housing, which is considerably more expensive than public housing in Singapore. So for those who have the money or the means to do so, they can move out early on in their lives and buy private housing. But otherwise, most of us actually still stay with our parents because housing is expensive, and we can only buy houses when we reach the age of 35 in Singapore. And participants who were more financially secure also rejected the need for the government to recognize their relationships legally. So these participants were worried about losing their freedoms if such legal recognitions were enacted in Singapore. So in this excerpt, we can see how Kamal rejected marriage as his relationship's financial resources already allowed them to obtain some legal aspects of heterosexual marriage. I have no desire to have kids. The concept of marriage, the concept of getting married has no meaning to me. I have my own home. The structural barriers in Singapore do not really affect me. So you can see how his own class, socioeconomic status actually allows him to rise above the challenges that were placed on others who were not able to afford housing and things like that. I want the government to stay out of my life as much as possible. They can keep those subsidies. It's not something that I want in my life. And such sentiments were also fiercely opposed by participants who were less financially secure. In addition to feeling frustrated In the previous superordinate theme, Brian further explained how he believed that people who opposed fighting aggressively for equality and rights in Singapore were usually wealthy and powerful. Brian believed that these rich and powerful gay men were worried about losing privileges and comforts that they had attained whenever Section 377A comes, or even LGBTQ rights and equality comes under the spotlight. Such sentiments seem to be confirmed by participants who allude to their high social status in this subordinate theme. And Brian also believed that those of higher socioeconomic status had the resources to live out their lives overseas or use their financial resources, as we have seen earlier through the previous quotes, to overcome some of the barriers that exist in the Singapore context. Here, Brian says, many gay people are very powerful and wealthy. They are the ones who feel that they have a lot to lose. They are the ones who, we do not have rights here, but I can always go to Madrid for my Mardi Gras. I can go somewhere else for my parties. They have the resources to do that. They can live out their gay lives there. They think that we are rocking the boat by fighting for equality and rights, LGBTQ equality and rights in Singapore. I think that is not right. That is being selfish. You have the resources. Not everyone has the kind of resources that you have.
Sorry, Alif.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's about 10 minutes. Don't want to rush you because it's amazing, but if you did want some question time.
Okay. I'm actually on the last superordinate theme, actually, yeah.
Amazing.
So, and the last superordinate theme highlighted how these gay men in long-term relationships believe in the strength of their love and relationships to overcome the challenges that they face in the Singapore context. So no matter what sources of support they had, no matter what socio-political stresses they face, most participants believe that their relationship was stronger than the challenges they face. So when I asked these two participants how they kept their relationship flourishing, Alvin highlighted how his relationship remained resilient because he and his partner choose to remain strong and happy in their relationship. Additionally, Rayson also highlighted how his relationship was strong because they were able to adapt to the evolving needs of their relationship over time. Again, reiterating how their love, the bond they have as a couple, was actually greater than the challenges they face. So through this superordinate theme, participants believe in strengthening their relationship from within and continue to evolve as a couple to overcome the stresses that they actually face. So just a bit of discussion on, so beyond the social and financial capital, the study, my study actually provided some insights into the pivotal influence of culture on gay intimate relationships in Singapore, as compared to our counterparts in less socially and politically conservative societies and countries. Participants in Singapore remain resilient through the utilization of collectivistic coping strategies. So this includes adjusting and accommodating to the socio-political context in Singapore, as well as reframing their thoughts and responses to adapt to their current circumstances positively, rather than directly confronting or being militant about the rights and equality in the Singapore context. And yeah, so I just wanted to show this final chart, graph, figure. So basically, we did talk a bit about the socioeconomic status and how that influences the preferences for whether we should be militant or aggressive in engendering change, or whether people would be more, oh no, we want something more peaceful, let's do it slowly, let's do it quietly, and things like that. So here is just a map which reveals the intersectionality between participants' SES or social class, and the differences in their experiences of stigma and discrimination. So actually, this was not something that is included in the paper that was published, but it's a table that I did up while I was doing the analysis and found that it's quite interesting to see how people who had the financial resources early on, they wanted to use more peaceful ways of engendering change, and while the ones who are not so fortunate, who had less resources, they wanted to fight continuously, pushing boundaries for LGBTQ rights and equality in Singapore. So if you wish to read my paper, you can actually find the paper through the following slide or link, UI. And just before I end my presentation, so these are some of the other studies that I am currently doing as part of my PhD. So I have given some of the findings from the constructions and representations of LGBTQ couples and families. I'm also doing I also did a cross-validation of the couple residence inventory. So that inventory was developed in the US, and we brought it to Singapore to see whether it would apply. And the final study actually drew on the first two studies to understand the moderators and mediators of couple level stresses and relationship outcomes among LGBTQ couples in Singapore. And I would like to acknowledge my PhD advisory panel, my school, Dr. Bradshaw, for having me here, the College of Health and Medicine at ANU, the LGBTQ participants, as well as organizations that helped with the study. And with that, thank you. Happy to.
Yeah, we
all-
have time for questions. Maybe while we're doing that, do you want to go back to the slide with the paper in case
Yeah,
anyone wants to grab a link there and have a microphone? Do we have any questions in the room or online?
None online so far.
Right, we'll go here.
Comment really the question. My name is Michelle Barrett. I'm a GP and a lecturer at the School of Health and Medicine. One of the things that I found interesting is your reflection on people of the higher socioeconomic status, because to my mind as a GP, it's a direct reflection on the social determinants of health, which I don't know that I would have extrapolated to this this way of life. So it's very illuminating for me.
Thank you. So for my last study on the moderators and mediators of stresses and outcomes, relationship outcomes, we did collect their socioeconomic status through their income and things like that. So that analysis is still ongoing. So I would be interested in also finding out whether that would extrapolate to a bigger quantitative study and see how financial resources actually help couples, buffer couples' experiences of stresses and their relationship outcomes and things. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Aaron. Currently a PhD student first year. So I'm the Bradshaw as my supervisor. And I have two questions. First is on I was wondering about the context of Singapore, how cultural aspects shape stigma and oppression among gay and bisexual, gay couples in Singapore, because I also came from a very conservative country from the Philippines. And drawing from the reflections of what Brett earlier said about colonization, and it's about how people from the past have might shape the current situation right now. In the Philippines, very conservative views about masculinity, machismo, we got from Spaniards colonization, and also how religious fundamentalism kind of shape the institution as general. So I was wondering about what's the context of Singapore. And my second question is on the process of the analysis itself. You've mentioned about trustworthiness and reflexivity, and I just wanted to learn about how you did your analysis coming from an in-group or out-group perspective, and how you make sense of the data in general. So I would love to learn how you did your analysis. Thank you.
I could probably answer your second question first. So in terms of whether I'm inside or outsider, I guess it would be both. I am an insider because I'm part of the community and I am in a long-term relationship. But at the same time, coming from a researcher perspective, coming from academia, it puts me as an outsider somewhat. So I have had to straddle that insider outsider perspectives, and doing that reflexivity has helped me reflect on my positionings within academia with as a gay man, for example, and as someone who is in a long-term relationship. So I think it's both an insider and outsider that I have to consider while doing the analysis. In terms of your first question, so I think in relation to like section 377A, from what I've read, the origins of that particular ruling was to prevent British civil servants from having sex with male sex workers back in that time. But then what happened was that the conservative community, the religious community in Singapore, thought that that ruling must have been enacted to uphold the moral rights or the morality of society, and therefore we should not repeal section 377A. So it was for another purpose, but then the religious conservative and even the government was like it's to prevent the lowering of morality in Singapore. So that and if you see sorry, let me just go back to. Yeah, so so this was the discourse analysis that I did, and in particular, this construction on LGBT couples not meant to be seen, heard, or taught in public spaces. You can see how some of the quotes that I had from the IPA study, how they internalize some of these quotes, like, oh, we should not seek explicit recognition, we should not seek explicitly for things that are not meant to be for us. So we can actually see how the discourses, the structures within society actually influence some of the discourses that they internalize themselves as part of their relationships, or as part of how they go through the stresses that they live with in Singapore. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think I'm okay.
Yeah.
It's just a question because
Sure.
very good talk.
Thank you.
But my question is, have you think about it? The genetics can be used to predict sexual orientations. Then by that way, you can provide more evidence scientifically to explain this phenomenon.
It's not something that I've thought about, but it's something that I think the religious conservatives have said that it's not conclusive. So they would use evidence such as being LGBTQ is genetically it's not conclusive. There's not enough evidence. So they reject the genetic part of how being LGBTQ is actually part of genetics, and said that evidence is inconclusive. There are many studies, as much as there are studies that says yes, there are also studies who say no. So they have tried to find ways of rationalizing their decision not to accept based on the inconclusiveness of genetic studies. Yeah.
Thank you.
So how are we going for time?
It's 102.
Okay.
Can I ask one question, please?
Yeah. Do you mind sticking around for tea and coffee afterwards? Yeah. All right, I think we'll wrap up there. Round of applause. Fantastic talk, and thanks everyone online. So no seminar this Thursday. We'll be back next Thursday for another guest speaker, Dr. Chris Clevel, joining us from UQ. So please come along to that. And we have tea and coffee in the foyer where we can continue questions and conversation. All right, thanks everyone. Another one.